Hello, good morning. We're going to start for next class for Tuesday. You should have read Chapter 13 on the federal judiciary, on the judiciary branch, judicial branch, and today we're going to talk, we're not going to get done, but we're going to talk about the executive branch bureaucracy. One of the things that any comments or questions before I start, or concerns? Okay. One of the things the President and the Congress have in common is they both seek ways to control the executive branch bureaucracy. The way Congress does this, one of the main ways Congress does this is twofold. First, Congress has to, well, first, the reason these agencies exist, of course, is because Congress has passed legislation and the President has signed it. The way that Congress tries to control the executive branch bureaucracy is by controlling the amount of funds that it appropriates for those agencies, and also congressional oversight, that congressional committees, through their hearings, or the congressional staff offices, the GAO and the CBO, can also exercise some oversight. The difficulty, however, that Congress faces is that the resources and number of personnel in the Congress is a very, very, very small percentage of the resources and personnel of the executive branch bureaucracy. You know, it's more like 20,000 against 2 million, so it's not really a fair fight. The President and Congress seek to monitor and control the bureaucracy. One of the ways the President tries to control the executive branch bureaucracy is through the appointment process, and the Senate also has a role in that, and also by the kinds of laws that are suggested over here on the right-hand side of the slide. Sunshine laws, use of the Freedom of Information Act, sunset laws, privatization of government programs, providing incentives for efficiency. All these things are efforts by the Congress, for the most part, to try to rein in and control the federal bureaucracy. So this is a breakdown of some of the resources that Congress and the President have to control the executive branch bureaucracy. The power of the purse, starting with Congress. The power of the purse, they control the money. Revising statutes that either add to or limit the power of agencies. Approving or not appointees to run agencies. Hearings and investigations or the threat of same. And the power to create, reorganize, and or destroy agencies. Presidents try to control the executive branch bureaucracy. I left an important one out here, but we've mentioned it in the past. Presidents exercise the appointment power of key leaders of executive branch agencies. Presidents make budget proposals regarding how much money various agencies should get. Presidents can themselves, to some degree, reorganize the structure of the executive branch bureaucracy, and they can issue executive orders. And again, the other way that presidents can try to control the bureaucracy is through the president's own bureaucracy, that is, the people who work directly for the president in the executive office of the president. And judicial review is a mechanism that the federal courts have with respect to controlling or influencing the actions of the other two branches, and we'll talk more about that next time next chapter when we get into the federal courts. So we already talked about this, that bureaucrats are politicians in the sense that they make policy. They are not elected. Their power comes from laws that Congress passes and the President signs. And then there's a rule-making process, which is very complicated, that we talked about last time. Federal agencies don't make rules and regulations willy-nilly. They don't just slapdash put them together. The purpose of these regulations is to enforce the law passed by Congress and signed by the President. So there's a lot of public comment, there are waiting periods, there can be court challenges, and so the time lag from when a law is passed to when the rules or the regulations governing the implementation of law, sometimes that takes a good while. Oops. One of the things we want to talk about today is, and this is in the text as well, and I'll focus on the iron triangle. Bureaucrats as policymakers engage with other actors in the political process and in the making of regulations and policy. And what I want to talk a lot about today is this notion of iron triangles and what they are and their implication for public policy in the United States. So one of the things I took from Douglas Amy's website, Government is Good, is some of the, one of the things that I tend to do is to be pretty critical of almost everything that I see. And yet it's important to recognize if you look at a 30-year period between 1960 and 1990, there are a huge number of successes and achievements that the federal government is largely responsible for. And these are some of them here. Some of the improvements in the conditions of life, both economic life, social life, and political life for the American people. I have a misspelling here. I left off a Y. But these are some of the significant achievements. Pollution is down a little bit. Percentage of people who are elderly living in poverty has been down, at least during this period of time. There's greater equal opportunity than there was in 1960. A whole number of measures of improvement. And here are some more. So not everything is bad. Not everything is awful. The world is not coming to an end. Does that mean there can't be improvements? Of course not. So there are any number of garden variety critics of the federal government's bureaucracy. Frankly, between us chickens, I've been involved for the past 4 months with one of the most frustrating battles with the federal bureaucracy, that's Medicare, that I have ever experienced. It's almost been like a full-time job. I won't go into any of the details, but getting them to do something that's really simple, or at least on its face appears really simple, sometimes really isn't so easy. And it's taken me 4 months and the help of the office of a United States Senator to get what I in fact deserved under the law. So, but there are a lot of criticisms of the federal bureaucracy. One, they try to expand their authority and the amount of power that they have and the range and scope of issues that they can control. Then another criticism is they develop political constituencies They look for interest group support and constituencies to support the agencies. They fight between one. I know this is true from my own research. They fight over jurisdiction and policy with other agencies. So agencies themselves fight and disagree. In some ways, the most consequential for the American people is the difference. And some of this comes out of the mission of different agencies. The most consequential may be the difference between the Department of State and the Department of Defense. We know that foreign policy and national security and the defense of the United States of America and its people is a very, very important policy area. The purpose and mission of the Department of State is to deal with matters of diplomacy in foreign policy. What's diplomacy? Well, diplomacy is communication. It's talk. It's negotiation. It's working with representatives of other governments around the world to try in a peaceful manner to achieve American foreign policy objectives. What's the purpose of the Pentagon or the Department of Defense? Well, the main purpose is to fight wars and to militarily defend the interests of the United States around the world. It's hard to talk and fight wars at the same time. It's done, but they're two fundamentally different. Shooting weapons, dropping bombs, and negotiation are two very different things. Another criticism of federal agencies, really all bureaucracies, is the quote-unquote spend it or lose it mentality. What does that mean? Agencies, government organizations get an annual budget, usually for what's called a fiscal year. Well, what happens when you get close to the end of the fiscal year and the agency still has a lot of money left? Well, if they don't spend it, what does Congress see? We gave this agency $10 billion, but they only spent $7.5 billion. I guess they really don't need all the money we appropriated. So next time in the budget process, we'll reduce the amount of money that this agency gets. So an agency doesn't want to be put in that position. So it may spend money needlessly or unwisely in order to spend all that was appropriated for it in the fiscal year. I'm not saying this always happens. I'm simply saying this as a criticism of bureaucracy. Another criticism is that bureaucracies can become aloof and paternalistic. They can be badly managed. They can and almost always are trying to avoid accountability. In daily life, the way you know you're dealing with an organization that seeks to avoid accountability is that it speaks in bureaucratic language which hides the responsibility for who made decisions when. They say, it was decided that. Okay, anytime you hear the passive voice and actors, individual persons or groups are not identified as decision makers, they're trying to hide their own responsibility for their actions. One of the clearest examples of efforts to try to confuse or to obscure what's going on in politics or in life from people is to use a passive voice and to try to hide who does what to whom. So, domestic policy especially tends, as often as not, to be dominated by iron triangles. And The triangle refers to the three types of participants in the policy-making process. The first is the executive branch agency. The second is Congress, and especially the committees and subcommittees that deal with the specific policy or issue area, rather, that the agency deals with. And the third is interest or clientele groups that have a similar interest in that policy area. So this is a really important concept because what it represents is a long-standing, ongoing series of relationships that often control public policy in American national government. Relationships between executive branch agencies, congressional actors, and interest groups. And there are implications for this that I'll get into as well. But this is absolutely critical to understanding what public policy is, how public policy gets made, and whose interests are best served by the policy process, more often than not. Any comments or questions about this notion of an iron triangle? The notion of triangle is clear because there are three types of actors. The term iron refers to long-standing, ongoing, very regularized, even entrenched relationships that have existed in the policy process long before any president takes office and long before you were ever born. Any comments or questions about this? Okay, so what the literature suggests is that policy complexes or sub-governments, I'll use the term interchangeably. Also, I'll use three terms interchangeably: policy complex, sub-government, and iron triangle. Seek to control, and often do control, government policy, especially domestic policy. So what the academic literature does is look at these three actor types and seeks to analyze the purposes and the interests of each of the three actor types. Executive branch agencies tend to seek political support. They want higher budgets, more often than not. They want more rather than less power, and often more employees and more employees with expertise. Because expertise for an executive branch agency is an important source of power. And if they don't have expertise, then they've got to get it from somewhere else, and that's a dependency that reduces their power. Members of Congress seek re-election. They want campaign contributions. They want to be able to bring back benefits and services to their district or to their state. If a member of Congress can't do something for his or her district or his or her state, if there's nothing visible that that congressman or senator can show his constituents or her constituents and take credit for it, then all of the things equal, they might be vulnerable when they seek re-election. And interest and clientele groups that have a specific interest in specific policy areas, provide information to members of Congress and executive agencies. And one of the reasons they do is because they seek favorable policy coming out of the Congress and out of the agencies themselves. And often they employ, as we shall see later, former federal employees who have expertise. So there's also a lot of literature out there about, well, who really controls of these three actors? Is it the agencies? Is it the Congress and the subcommittees and subcommittees of Congress? Is it the clientele groups? There's no answer to that question because there are many different policy areas, as you well know: energy, transportation, health, housing, defense, environment. So there's not just one policy area, there's slews of policy areas. And one can't assume that the same actor type in each controls, but rather it's a matter for empirical investigation. Who controls, and it can change over time. So this is an image of what the sub-governments or the iron triangles look like. And this is an abbreviated number of, obviously their number of cabinet level departments are in the mid-teens, and I'm only showing about 8 or 9 here, 8 here. So this chart, if you will, really extends across a whole range of policy areas that include these. These are in the blue area of the chart are cabinet level departments, but there are many others as well. So what you have is on top is the various policy areas. HHS, by the way, is Health and Human Services. And then on the left-hand side of the chart, you have the executive branch agencies, the Congress, the House and the Senate, and its relevant committees and subcommittees and clientele groups. And then, so the sub-government or policy complex or iron triangle is vertical. So, and they're going to be different actors, different committees, different agencies, different clientele groups in each of the policy areas. Very few political actors are interested in or have the resources to deal with all public policy areas. Probably the one that has the broadest range of interest is the Chamber of U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But so as you think about these, the triangles go vertical. Okay, they go up and down, vertical. So what are some of the characteristics of the iron triangles or sub-governments? This is the permanent government of the United States in a policy sense. In the executive branch agencies, you have civil servants with expertise in specific policy areas. When it says here that these sub-governments are autonomous silos, what it's saying is the folks, when you think of this vertically, these are experts in or people who, or actors who are concerned about transportation policies. These are concerned about housing. These are concerned about interior and the responsibilities of the Interior Department. Commerce is obvious, economic policy, business, and so on. Trade, defense is also obvious. Agriculture, obviously we know what that is. Energy, same thing. So people, these policy complexes are autonomous. That, in other words, if people in housing were to say to the people or the groups in transportation or the actors in transportation, well, we think you should do this, the transportation people are going to say, hey, dude, shut up. We don't tell you what to do with housing. You don't tell us what to do with transportation. And so the expertise becomes a kind of calling card, a kind of entry vehicle for the agencies, the congressional committees and subcommittees, and the interest groups to get into and have some credibility in a policy complex or sub-government. So if one thinks of these in vertical terms, then they compete for power and resources. They compete for who's going to control policy. They sometimes compete, not sometimes, often compete internally for who's going to control policy. Keep in mind that the budget of the federal government of the United States is finite. It can't spend money, without any regard whatsoever to what revenues are. And so money resources in the budget are limited. And so given the limitation of funds, and especially in recent years, the funds going to domestic policy areas to the degree that it's been growing very, very slowly, that the competition for funds amongst these different policy complexes is substantial. And what I mean by funds is tax dollars, budget appropriations. What keeps these policy complexes or sub-governments together? What keeps them together is they try to help each other achieve their goals. Okay, political support, the agencies want to grow, they want to survive, they want more power. People in Congress want to get reelected, interest groups want favorable policy. So they work together to try to achieve those purposes. And since this framework for public policy has been around for decades, it can be and often is resistant to presidential directive. This is what, and of course, as I said, it's extended. It's not just these policy areas. It's all of them. This is the barrier to a major barrier to a president's ability to control domestic, and for that matter, foreign, to some degree, policy, but especially domestic policy. This is kind of complicated, so I'm going to stop and ask if you have questions about this. Anybody? Okay, so this is some of the stuff that we just talked about in terms of the attributes of the policy system. One of the things that I did not mention that comes out of this is if it's hard for presidents to coordinate this, and if the vertical nature of sub-governments or iron triangles persists, then the possibility for coordinated public policy is very, very limited. And so you get policy in one area, you get policy in another area, but it's left to the president and those who work directly for the president in the executive office of the president to try to coordinate what is in fact a policy system that tends to resist coordination and that tends to be uncoordinated. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, and I've already suggested this, is that the vertical nature of the competitive nature of the policy system and the individual sub-governments is such that they don't want new members. These actors have established over a long period of time working relationships that are mutually beneficial to them. They're not interested in hearing from newcomers. They're not so interested in new ideas or perspectives that might tend to modify or upset the existing relations between the actors and existing policy. So to say that is to say that the policy process is quite a bit entrenched to the degree that these iron triangles, in fact, are iron. Any comments about this? Okay, so if we go back to the chart here, there's a lot of literature and actually a lot of good investigative journalism as well that looks at specific policy areas and concludes that at least in some policy areas, at some points in time, clientele groups or interest groups with specific policy goals in mind often dominate the policy process. Doesn't mean they always do, and there's a lot of literature in some areas that suggests alternative explanations. But one body of literature looks at how interest groups come to dominate the policy process, and it might be added that to the degree that they do, they are able to get favorable policy that benefits them, but probably doesn't benefit or advance the interests of the American people. So one of the concepts that describes how interest groups or clientele groups gain power over the policy process is agency capture. Agency being an executive branch agency. How does an agency get captured? How does an agency of the executive branch of the federal government lose its control over the implementation of public policy? That's what the concept agency capture addresses. And the answer is that, first, that clientele groups use their economic power to leverage favorable public policy. Second, they, in fact, may even take over, literally take over the agencies or an agency that is supposed to be making policy regarding an issue area or an industry. That industries then dictate the terms and policies to the agency rather than the other way around. And that, therefore, this undermines democracy, decreases competition, elevates prices, and shuts out the American people from the policy process. If you want to look at the poster child for agency capture, I would refer you to the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Not that there aren't all kinds of. I would refer you to two things. One is the work, well, I'll refer you to this one. The Reagan administration, especially the Departments of Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency. And in fact, the agency capture in those two cases was so significant that a number of people lost their jobs, and a couple very high-placed people in those agencies went to prison. And one other comment about this before we move on, that one of the reasons I say these agencies were poster children for agency capture is that the Reagan administration brought in to run the Environmental Protection Agency people who had been professionals who had been fighting environmental regulations their whole lives, who had been opposed to environmental regulation. That's who we brought in to run the agency. Similarly with the Department of Interior. It's supposed to protect public lands, not plunder them. And in fact, what the administration did 30 years ago is to bring in people who did exactly that, and they eventually were found out. So here's a more current example of agency capture. It's Energy Information Administration. So this was an agency that was developed to see that the Department of Energy had its own data, had its own information, had the capacity to analyze the information necessary to make good policy. And what happened was the Congress, in fact, cut substantially, by 14%, the budget in 2011. And one of the consequences of that was that the agency itself had a markedly reduced ability to gather data, to make sense of data, to make sense of the information that it needed to make good policy. And as a consequence, I mean, the agency still existed, it just didn't have adequate resources to do what it was supposed to do. And so what the New York Times found in its reporting is that the agency began to rely on the data and research and information provided by consultants who had financial ties to the natural gas industry. In other words, unable to generate its own information and data and analyze it independently, it came to rely on information provided by those who the agency was supposed to regulate. And so, for example, here in the second bullet, a senior agency geologist said that upper management relied too heavily upon outside contractors and relied upon all too often unreal data from industry releases. And so essentially the agency outsourced some of its role to industry and used industry's findings and data as the basis for public policy. Let me just throw one other thing out there, and that is that one of the single most important public policy issues concerns data and information and the degree to which policymakers think we need to count something. If governments don't count something, by definition, the government is saying it's not important. Lots of things that are very important don't get counted. So the decision to, in fact, count, to collect data, is a very important policy decision by governments, because how do you make intelligent public policy if you have no information on which to base it? Are you just going to make stuff up? In fact, that's what a lot of people do. The second conflict that exists over counting is, well, is it counted right? Is it counted appropriately? Is it counted in a biased way? And so both of these sets of questions, whether it should be counted or not, and if so, how is it counted? These are two really important political questions and policy questions. Always. They don't sound like they're important. I mean, what's counting? But it's very important. Just to give you one example, and this goes across all policy areas. The United States has had troops in Afghanistan for more than a decade. Is there anybody in class that can tell me how many people who are residents of Afghanistan, or for that matter, neighboring Pakistan have been killed as a consequence of American military being in Afghanistan and occasionally Pakistan? And the answer is no. No one knows. Someone knows, and it probably is counted somewhere. But as a basis for policy decision, it never sees the light of day. The number, and it's not just the numbers that are important, it's also what those numbers mean. And that's that's a third set of questions about counting and numbers in public policy. Even if people agree that something should be counted, and even if they agree that the numbers are in fact accurate, people in politics, people in public office will disagree about what those numbers signify, what they mean, what significance they have for making policy decisions. So that's a little tangent I just went off on. I still want to go back to the Energy Information Agency. So in 2010, there was that huge oil spill, the largest ever in the Caribbean. And the president appointed a commission to investigate why this disaster occurred. And in fact, as a consequence, as part of that, the president also restructured the agency and renamed it. It was formerly one of the agencies. It was formerly the Minerals Management Service, and so this is another example of agency capture and failure. So these were long-standing problems, and here are some of the criminal penalties and fines that were exacted as a consequence of the BP oil spill. British Petroleum, at least 12 felony guilty pleas, along with fines ranging up to $50 billion. Transocean, $1.4 billion in fines. It was guilty of violating the Clean Water Act. Halliburton, $1.1 billion, and Anadarko facing at least $4.6 billion in liability. One of the problems here that shows the limits of the federal government, and especially the Justice Department and the companies involved, is that the companies are big, and they have. I mean, if you can pay a $50 billion fine and survive like nothing happened, you've got a lot more resources than the government of the United States to fight ongoing legal battles. So this is still regarding the Deepwater spill in the Caribbean in 2010. The World Resources Institute did a study of the disaster, and they looked at over a 30-year period, and these, down in the bottom half of the slide, were the key findings. That the relevant government agencies couldn't keep pace with new drilling technologies. And so these new technologies tended to undermine the existing guidelines, making them either not really relevant or not enforced. Secondly, that the collection and expenditure of oil revenues was not transparent. There was little accountability. And as a consequence, the fees that were owned by the companies, those fees are supposed to be determined by the agency couldn't do it. And thirdly, the World Resources Institute identified a revolving door culture. We've talked about this in the past, between the public and the private sector, which coincided with the failure of the U.S. Attorney to prosecute ethical breaches. So the Boston Globe looked at a different example of this revolving door, and that is the Pentagon, the Defense Department. And we'll pick up with this next time. We've got about 6 or 7 more slides to go, and we'll be done with the executive branch and move into, in quick order, into the discussion of the judicial branch next time. Have a good weekend.